All right, welcome everybody to our second session for UC GIS Week. Today we will be having a session on public health challenges. We have three presentations with two different speakers. Really excited to welcome at first Sailing Tan. And at first, Sailing is going to talk about cross-estimation of cancer incidence at census-tract levels to assess risk near Superfund sites in Puerto Rico. Sailing, take it away.
Um, just share my screen first. And okay, so my name is Sailing. I'm a UC Berkeley alumni, and I did my master's in both occupational environmental epidemiology and geospatial data science at the University of Michigan. And this is a project that, as part of my master's program, that I did last summer with the Comprehensive Cancer Center at the University of Puerto Rico. And this is kind of just like like a encapsulation of what I did last summer and what is GIS related. So it also talk about the cross estimations, but also still talk about things leading up to that project. So just to contextualize, Puerto Rico is a island, part of the US, and their concern was more about living near Superfund sites, which are, for those that don't know, these EPA designated waste sites that they put a lot of money into cleaning up, which can pose increased risk of exposures to chemicals of concern and also carcinogenic substances. So understanding the relationship between living near Superfund sites and cancer incidence can help recognize communities at a greater risk. There's a lot of literature about higher cancer incidences, with like Love Canal being like the most common moment in history where people were talking about living near hazardous waste sites and cancer risk. And at the time I did the project, there was about 19 active sites and 7 deleted, and one that was not on the list by the EPA Protection Agency. So for the deleted and the not on the list of EPA protection, or from the EPA, I still included them in the analysis because cancer has a bit of a longer latency period, and you might still have instances of cancer even though it was recently cleaned up. And some of the context of like why I was wanting to do this project is because public data related to cancer rates are usually at county levels, which can be really big, and it's mostly for privacy concerns. But there are also all these limitations of aggregated data at the municipality level. Municipality and county are synonymous, and this kind of implied important assumptions that prompted like the desire to kind of disaggregate the data and do an estimation across scales. And Halsey et al. Is et al. Paper kind of provided some context on how to do this, and that generally included making population weights and then conducting these cancer incidence rate at a census tract level. So here is just kind of a map of where it was at 2020, and I just used 2020 as like a stepping point to see because there was the US Census in 2020, and also help with figuring out what the process would be like and then changing it up later. But these are all the current sites, mostly in the northern region, and the bolded lines are the health regions, and for the green ones, those are the deleted sites. And these islands to the side are not inhabited, but Culebra and Vieques are. And tends to be a little bit more touristic, but there are residents there. And Vieques has a big history of being a Superfund site. It used to be where the US Navy practiced drills. So there's a lot of contamination there, and still a lot of unexploded ordinances in that island. And that was entered in as a um, Superfund site around 2003 and is still a Superfund site. So some of the work that I did leading up to this, I did included identifying what are the social demographic variables of residents living near Superfund sites, and I did that using a buffer analysis. So for all the different points, I created buffers of if the centroid of the census tract overlaps within 5 kilometers, and then between 5 to 10, and then over 10. I collected data from the US Census and for at the census tract level, and then compared the proportion of means of people living in those areas. So, I just really like this project because it kind of highlight why are we concerned about the communities living nearby. And so for those variables, I we found that females of reproductive age, children, and individuals with a disability, those that were unemployed or uninsured, and living under the federal poverty line had significantly higher means living within 5 kilometers of a Superfund site. And I used an ANOVA test to conduct that analysis. And then also there's a post ANOVA test called the Tukey HSD to kind of compare those intervals. And then to kind of link it more closely to cancer, as a starting point, I did just an analysis with does the county have a Superfund site versus the ones that don't, and then did an incidence rate ratio to compare the cancer rates between the two categories. And for that one, I looked at both overall cancers and prostate cancer and breast cancer, but the ones that came out significant were colon and rectum cancer and also leukemia. So for the counties that had Superfund sites, there were higher rates of those types of cancers. And then so finally to the aim that I was going for was to look at more of a linear continuous distance in a numeric way. What is the association between residence distance to Superfund sites and cancer risk? So um, basically, I collected data from the Puerto Rico Cancer Registry and the US Census to get the cancer incidence rates. And this is at a county level that it's showing all the same, but I had the census tract in there to be able to multiply this weight estimation later. But what I did was also use the census tract population in 2020 and divided that by the municipality population size to get a population weight, and then multiplied the cancer count of 2020 with the population weight, and then use the weight matrix in R to try to run a regression analysis using the span package in R. And this was the equation that I ended up having was for the cancer cases and the distance and adding the spatial effect as well as offsetting by the population. And this is what the estimations ended up looking like. So there are some slight changes within the boundaries of the counties for the different census tracts, motivated by what census tracts have more population. And then arguably there was not that big of a difference. So, a lot of these previous analyses kind of showed for a better understanding of locations and what are the more accurate evaluations to see the associations between cancer risk and exposure to Superfund sites. Because at first with the county, assumed that the whole population lived at the centroid of the county and that they've always been living there and didn't really consider daily movement, work, study, or time of residing. That problem still kind of continues. But it also assumed that these people are exposed to the same type and the same amount of pollutant substances. So after the estimation, it still had a weak association between cancer incidence and the distance from the census tract centroid to the nearest Superfund site. And it showed in a way, maybe for every increase the interpretation was that for every increase in kilometer, there is a 1% decrease in cancer incidence at the census tract level, and similarly in the census tract level. So that was the results that I had in the interpretation that I had for the incidence rate ratio. So just concluding and going into future directions, kind of still, because there is a lot of literature showing that there is residential exposures to environmental hazards continue to be a concern for cancer risk, but it's really difficult to establish causality because of long-term exposure and also the long latency period of cancer, and especially for nearby communities. And while this analysis didn't yield that notable changes, some of the future steps to improve the analysis are control for specific cancer-causing carcinogens and specific cancer types, because this has been kind of in the early work, so it's a little bit more ecological and just kind of getting a feel for the process. And potentially using a different time frame, maybe more of a 5-year time frame, or using a different regression models to maybe adjust for like potential over dispersion. And so this is back to what I said in the beginning. This is Vieques Island, some of the ongoing contamination that's still left over, and early protests to get the US Navy out of the island. So I just want to acknowledge my professor or my mentors at the center, specifically Dr. Ortiz and Cardona Cordero. I had some help from the biostats, which is Dr. Velasquez and Liliana, and also um, people from the cancer registry, which is Dr. Ortiz and Carlos. And yeah, if you have any future questions or have suggestions or would like to collaborate, feel free to email me at sailtang@umich.edu. And this was the cohort that I was with. And also, if I have a quick time for a plug for the program that I was in, they are accepting applicants for people that are interested in that are health related and would be interested in doing some of this work. They recently got a P20 grant from the NIH that is kind of related to climate change and understanding its effects on cancer risk, especially the continuum of care for cancer. How does like things like hurricanes affect like people's ability to continue access to care? And I know that GIS work is something that they're really interested in. So that is my project. Thank you so much for listening. And yeah,
Thank you so much. And I just want to remind everybody, we're going to take questions at the end of our three presentations. Uh, and if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat in the meantime. Otherwise, I'm now going to introduce Ryan Brulman of UC Riverside to talk about dollar stores and public health policy.
All right, go ahead and share my screen. All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Ryan Broman. I am a PhD candidate at the University of California, Riverside. And today I'm going to talk about why, when we think about one's food environment, it might be important to think about dollar stores, especially as it relates to public health policy and some of the potential future implementations. So first is just a general introduction. We all know that a healthy diet is important. We know it's important when it comes to cardiovascular health, metabolic health, throughout the lifespan, whether it be preventing disease or helping to prevent it from becoming worsening or other risk factors from manifesting themselves. So it is important to be eating a healthy diet. However, a healthy diet depends heavily on access. And this kind of is where you bring in one's food environment. So what is in one's general area when it comes to their overall location depends and heavily influences their diet choices. Now, traditionally, with a lot of these grocery sources, where one would get a lot of their diet choices from, you think of a traditional grocery store. You might think of an Albertsons, a Ralph's, a Vons for those that are in the California area, or things like Sprouts, Whole Foods, things like that. You might not necessarily think of a dollar store, though, but a dollar store potentially could be one that could creep in as a consideration for a grocery store. Now, traditionally, those are not considered grocery sources. They are considered by the Census Bureau to be general merchandise stores. However, I'm going to try to hopefully convince you that dollar stores should be potentially considered as grocery sources. So, why consider a dollar store? Well, if you haven't been inside one or haven't been inside one recently, this might be what it typically looks like when you walk inside. There are, general merchandise, as it says in the census designation. However, there are also plenty of groceries available as well. Now, research shows that more and more households are utilizing dollar stores as grocery stores. Things like inflation, crazy prices when it comes to eggs, beef, regular produce, are driving a lot of people to pinch pennies and get groceries at cheaper alternatives. However, when you go into a dollar store, as you can see in this picture here, what you see as far as grocery and food options differs vastly from a traditional grocery store itself. So a dollar store is important to consider because you're going to have things like less fresh produce options. If you see fresh produce, apples, banana, it's going to be a much smaller section, less variety. You will typically have less choice when it comes to fibrous foods, whole grains, and then you're not going to be able to go up to a counter to get freshly cut protein, seafood, a butchery, or anything like that. So it's very important to distinguish dollar stores differently from a traditional grocery store just because of the emphasis on overall processed foods and potential unhealthy options. Now, when we talk about food environment, a common food policy trend would be talking about food deserts or food swamps. Food deserts are designated by the USDA, areas that have high poverty but also low access, and this is talking just about traditional grocery stores. Food swamps, on the other hand, are swamped, so to speak, with unhealthy options, things like convenience stores, the little corner stores, and fast food restaurants that kind of outpace or outweigh your traditional grocery stores. Now, typically, the food policy interventions when it comes to food deserts or food swamps, first with food deserts, they typically try to increase traditional grocery store access. So that means putting a traditional grocery store in an area that typically does not have access to one. Or in the case of many food swamps, they might try to slow or stop further convenience stores or fast food locations from popping up in a specific area. However, research has shown that both of these type of policy interventions tend to be quite unsuccessful in actually changing behaviors or changing health outcomes in the long term. A lot of times when you put a traditional grocery store in an area that may not have high access, that doesn't always equate to people actually going to shop there. Similarly with trying to slow the fast food or convenience stores from growing in that area, that doesn't always equate to changing the behaviors of individuals in that general area as well. So what I'm going to talk about is considering additional things when it comes to one's food environment. So with that, the data that I'm working with kind of pre-COVID level data, so roughly 2016, 2017 time point. What I've done is I've geocoded food source locations across the United States, and I've used ArcGIS network analysis to kind of look at access to these different locations. So across the United States, I've done fast food locations, I've done convenience stores, as well as traditional grocery stores, both regional, local, and kind of just US based chains, and then dollar stores as well. Your dollar stores being places like Dollar General, Family Dollar, Dollar Tree. Interestingly enough, dollar stores actually outnumber traditional grocery stores across the United States. What I've done is I've done linear regression within ArcGIS, but for that I've used some different metrics. So looking at the food desert designation by the USDA, I've looked at food swamp designation. This is based on something called the Retail Food Environment Index, or REFI, that I'll talk about in just a little bit, as well as some socioeconomic factors. So we know that there's more to it than just being close to a potential grocery source. It also matters on affordability and other access metrics as well. So the CDC, Center for Disease Control Social Vulnerability Index, brings in things like per capita income, poverty rates, vehicle access, which are all very important and relevant for grocery access. And then I've brought in health outcomes. So my outcomes for these models would be health outcomes related to cardiometabolic health across US census tracts. And for this, I'm using another CDC metric, which is the 500 Cities Project. This includes large cities across metro areas over the United States, the census tracts. And for this, I'm going to specifically just focus in on obesity today, but this does correlate to other different metabolic and cardiovascular health outcomes. So just to kind of summarize with the designations, just so that we can kind of classify and put a bucket in each one, or put each one in a bucket. So low income and low access to a traditional grocery store, that's going to be your food desert. The REFI, that retail food eating index, is going to be based on the fast food and establishments and convenience stores outweighing traditional grocery stores. So if that number is higher, that's indicative of a food swamp designation. And then the one that I'm going to bring up is kind of replacing that fast food and establishments and convenience stores, but just looking at dollar stores with this quality ratio. So if that ratio is higher, dollar stores outnumber your traditional grocery stores. And that's what I'm going to test out today to see how it compares against some of the food desert and food swamp metrics. So for this, I'm going to start looking at Chicago. So Midwestern city, you can see here over on the right, the overall obesity rates across the city, with redder areas being much higher obesity rates. And you can see clear clusters on the west side as well as the south side of Chicago. If we look at food desert designation, now, this is significantly associated with obesity rates. And if you look at the hatched areas, which represent food deserts, you can see some of the hatched areas do overlap with areas of higher obesity rates. But in both of these areas on the west and the south side, it's a little bit of a patchwork. So there's not complete coverage. It's not fully addressing all areas that have these high levels of obesity rates. If we look at food swamps now, so this hatched area is now switched over to food swamps. Interestingly, a lot of the food swamps are kind of more so on the downtown and north side of Chicago. There are a few on the west side that get captured with the high obesity rates, but interestingly, the model shows significant negative associations with food swamp designations. If we combine both of these into the same model, these associations hold. But now, looking at the quality ratio, the one that I brought up with dollar stores over traditional supermarkets, there are significances within the quality ratio. You can see significant positive associations with higher levels of dollar store access relative to traditional grocery stores are significantly associated with obesity rates. And you can see clear clusters on the south side, which the hatched areas would be those high levels of dollar store access. And then the west side, more so northwest side of Chicago. It's again not a perfect fit. There are some red tracks that are not hatched in these areas, but it does clearly delineate different areas within Chicago. And you can see for the stats lovers out there, the overall model fit with the AIC and the adjusted R squared hint at potential better model fits with the quality ratio over the food desert and food swamp. Next, I want to shift into a little bit more of a familiar city to probably many people here, since we are in UCGIS week, being Los Angeles. So Los Angeles, again, you can see the obesity rates here. South of downtown, kind of in the Florence Graham area, is going to be your higher pockets of obesity rates. If we look at food deserts, they again are significantly associated with obesity rates. But you can also look kind of more finely at this red area, and you can see again, it's a patchwork quilt. There are areas that are not fully covered by food deserts, meaning that those areas wouldn't be a high priority as far as receiving food desert um, policy interventions. If we look at the food swamps, better coverage overall, and it is significantly associated, but there are quite a few kind of like false positives, if you will, here, where there are areas of lower obesity rates, but they are designated as food swamps. You can see kind of the areas on the north side of Hollywood there, or areas down south, closer to Long Beach. Combining those two maintains the overall significance and the overall positive rates with obesity. Now, if we look at the quality ratio, this is significantly associated with overall obesity outcomes. And over on the right, you can see, again, fairly good coverage, not perfect coverage, but there are still some overlaps with like the Long Beach area having lower obesity rates, but generally speaking, it does quite well at capturing a lot of the higher areas of obesity rates. Now, I want to finish up on a city in the South to kind of get a broad range of regions. And I want to talk a little bit about New Orleans. So, New Orleans, in the South here, we can see high levels of obesity throughout quite a bit of the area. If we look across first food deserts, kind of like what we have with both Los Angeles and Chicago, you can see that there is no significant association between food deserts and obesity rates. It's all about the socioeconomic factors. They heavily weigh in on the associations with obesity. And looking kind of more at the map level, you can see there are red There are plenty of red tracts that are not hatched or designated as food deserts. It's very similar associations, but kind of reversed, where a lot of those areas that were not hatched are hatched in the food swamps, but they are, again, not significantly associated. It's still all about the socioeconomic factors. Combining those two together, it's still kind of the same story of not significant associations with obesity. But looking at the quality ratio, that does emerge as a significant factor. Again, very much still heavily influenced by socioeconomic factors, which is traditionally the story with the South, that socioeconomic factors do play a large role. So again, it's not a perfect fit with talking about the quality ratio, but it does tell somewhat of a story when it comes to the overall impact that even when controlling for socioeconomic factors, this quality ratio with considering dollar stores does still stick out with these cardiometabolic outcomes. So ultimately, just going to conclude with dollar stores seem to have an influence on overall health. They do seem to matter when it comes to a grocery stores, given that the trends show people are generally shopping at them, and you can see the health associations that are present. Now, food deserts and food swamps are traditionally used for the policy interventions, but there may be some information that we could gain by including dollar stores in the picture. It seems like there's something to be said about dollar stores and the quality of produce and groceries that are located within those locations. Now, we saw that regionally and within city, that's not a perfect fit. So there are some things to consider, whether it be you're looking across regions or even within cities. Like Chicago, for example, while it did show those clusters, it didn't fully account for all of the areas that had high levels of obesity. So it's not going to be a one size fits all approach. And then what we know from previous food desert and food swamp policies, so kind of the inserting grocery stores in or trying to bring down the level of unhealthy food options, might not necessarily be a great policy approach. There might be something that we can do besides restricting dollar stores. Maybe think about local policies or implementations, ordinances that could take place regarding dollar stores, or having dollar stores work with local farmers to bring in potential fresh, low-cost produce could be an option as well. I just want to acknowledge both my labs at University of Colorado Boulder and University of California Riverside, and happy to take any questions once the presentations are over.
Thank you so much, Ryan. Really fascinating. I know I have some questions for you once we get to that point. And I am really excited to hand things back over to Sailing for a second presentation in this session. Sailing, take it away. You're muted.
Thank you, Maggie. Yeah, so I'm back here again. So this past summer, I won't reintroduce myself, but this past summer I was working in a separate internship similar to the one that I did the year before, but through a different funding opportunity where I also used a lot of GIS to kind of craft my results. So I was working with the Econ School of Medicine in Mount Sinai, and they have a longstanding collaboration with the National Institute of Public Health in Mexico. So the project I was working on there is titled Spatial Distribution of Organochlorine Pesticide Serum Concentrations in Mexican Children Living in and Out of the Polluted Atoyac Watershed Basin. So just to contextualize a little bit as well, so the Atoyac Riverside Basin is one of the most polluted regions in Mexico, near the Puebla-Tlaxcala metropolitan area, and a lot of their sources of pollution come from agriculture, but also in rapid rate of industrialization, mostly from chemical, automotive, metal, and textile production, and also mostly from international companies, and also wastewater from Puebla City, which is a very urban area. So the ongoing environmental degradation and lack of regulation increases exposure risks, especially for children during vulnerable stages of development. And that is like related to brain growth or cognition or social skills. So for organochlorine pesticides, these are highly toxic and synthetic chemicals that are slow to degrade and have a tendency to bioaccumulate in the environment. And in Mexico, they were used extensively from the 50s to the early 2000s for agriculture and vector control, particularly for like malaria and dengue, with some OCPs like lindane and endosulfan used until very recently. And long-term associated health effects could be cancer or neurological disorders, endocrine disruption, respiratory diseases, and neurodegenerative diseases, but exposure to early life stages can be linked to low birth weight and neurodevelopmental toxicity and delayed postnatal growth. So these are just images from a um, systematic review, kind of outlining the area. It is more in central Mexico, south of Mexico City, and these are the different rivershed basins and the rivers that kind of go into this dam. And here's like a aerial view of the river really close to other industries. So the methods for this analysis, the study population, the team at the INSP had already collected interviews and serum samples from controls in a case control study from 2021 to 2024. And these are for children and adolescents ages 2.5 to 20 years old in Puebla, Tlaxcala, and Oaxaca. And this is kind of where these three states sit in Mexico as well. And the determination of the organochlorine pesticides are from serum lipid OCP concentrations in nanograms per gram and divided by serum concentrations and total lipid content. And my main role was to georeference these participants into either living inside or outside the Atoyac region. So the data that's recorded is at which AHEB, and that is kind of similar to zip codes, but then for the coding itself, we use municipalities. So if that AHEB was in a municipality, it was coded as, it's shaded here as gray. And then this purple line is for any municipality that overlaps with the outline of the Atoyac Rivershed Basin. So any participants that were from those municipalities were considered as within the Atoyac group. And then we conducted a chi-squared test and a Mann-Whitney U test for the social demographic variables in our statistical analysis. And then for further comparison, there were about 24 organochlorine pesticides, but for those that were over 10% limit of detection, we compared those directly with the t-test. And for all these white areas, it's areas where we weren't able to capture participants, and that's just because it was really expensive and time consuming to be able to gather people from every single area. So these are the main results from our social demographic variables for comparing between those that lived within and outside the Atoyac Rivershed Basin. And it was a predominantly male cohort and also tended to lean more older. And for the things that call a lot more attention is that for inside the Atoyac Basin, there was lower birth weight compared to those living outside, as well as for the education of the parents, they were a lot higher within the Atoyac Basin compared to those living outside the Atoyac Basin. And that's kind of expected because in urban areas, there is a little bit more access to education. And then for outside the Atoyac Rivershed Basin, there was a higher percentage of those speaking indigenous languages, and that was recorded as at least one person in the home speaks an indigenous language that isn't Spanish. And finally, outside the Atoyac Rivershed Basin, it tended to be a little less urban and a little bit more rural. And these were the OCPs that were over 10% of limit of detection in the sample population. So for all of them, besides PPDDE, they were much higher outside within the Atoyac Basin. And for PPDDE, it was significantly higher outside the Atoyac basin, which I'll talk a little bit more in the next slides. But for HCB and dieldrin, those were significantly higher within the Atoyac basin, with oxychloroquine and endosulfan sulfate still higher within the basin, but not significantly. So for a lot of the mapping, we uh, leveled them into tertiles, and then this is for HCB, oxychloroquine, endosulfan, and dieldrin, and you can see that the colors tend to be a little bit darker within the blue lines, which is the Atoyac Basin, and most likely because of higher industrialization and urbanization near the Atoyac Rivershed Basin. And it's interesting that these were significantly higher for HCB and dieldrin because they were restricted in the Stockholm Convention. And for endosulfan, sulfate, and oxychloroquine, those are both metabolites which were higher in the Atoyac, and their parent compound, which is endosulfan and chlordine, those were eliminated in the COFAPRIS in 2016, which is similar to, it's a regulatory agency in Mexico for things like pesticides. So this kind of highlights that the persistence in the environment is potentially due to ongoing illegal use or continued detection in the sample population because of bioaccumulation. And for the second pattern, this was for more specifically PPDDE, which is a metabolite of PPDDT, and that was more higher outside that Atoyac, mainly in Oaxaca, which is where you see them outlined over here. And Oaxaca tends to definitely be more of a tropical area, so you're probably going to see more vectors like mosquitoes and need for control of vector-borne diseases. So there was a heavy historical use of PPDDT in Oaxaca for controlling malaria and dengue in 1956 as part of a WHO pilot program. And about 95% of the participants had PPDDE, so that's a lot more, most of the participants that were in the project. And then it kind of potentially also highlights the long half-life or transfer of the chemical from mother to child, either through placenta or lactation. And then finally, PPDDT, although it wasn't mentioned in the table 2 or the second results, it was detected in about 7% of the samples, which is possibly because it has a shorter half-life of about 6 years and potentially also a more recent exposure, even though it was restricted in 2000 in Mexico. So in conclusion, this kind of just highlights the long history of environmental degradation in the Atoyac Rivershed Basin and the need for more regulation by the government and increased biomonitoring for the people living in the area. And highlights a lot of potential adverse health effects in children, which is a lot of what the people in the group that I was working with at the INS was looking at, like relationship to leukemia or cancer. And this is like a really good video. I won't play it, but it does highlight a lot of the issues that go on in the area, and it's has a lot of testimonials from residents and also from parents of children who are suffering from adverse health diseases like cancer. Oops, sorry. I was not going to play that. So thank you for your attention. Just want to thank my mentors from Mexico, which is Rodrigo and Angel and Dr. Lopez Carrillo, and a lot of my cohort mates that were a lot of emotional support throughout the summer. And again, if you have any questions related to the project, feel free to reach out to me or any opportunities like this if you're in the health related field and want to learn more.
Thank you very much to our two wonderful presenters for this session. It is now time for questions. We have a question from George in the chat for Ryan, asking what percentage of food items sold at these locations are SNAP eligible in a food desert versus a food swamp?
Yeah, I my analysis didn't necessarily break down, I guess, like the difference in SNAP eligible. I will say that as far as fast food locations and convenience stores, it does depend on the state. Some states do participate in like an expanded network where you can buy food items from fast food locations or restaurants for utilizing SNAP. As far as dollar stores generally do accept SNAP for food items, that are eligible, just like a grocery store. So theoretically, you could utilize SNAP at either location. Sorry, I'm not able to fully answer that question, but hopefully future research can kind of look at that.
You and I have a question for sailing on your first talk specifically. Your first talk I found particularly interesting. I grew up only half a mile from a Superfund site and didn't even know it until I was in my early 20s. So I'm always really fascinated by some of this Superfund site research. Uh, so yours, of course, was focused on Puerto Rico. And I was wondering if, and this is sort of a broad question, but if there are any particulars about Puerto Rico in terms of its status as a territory as opposed to a state in the United States that could either make this type of research more challenging or maybe easier to do if you were to try and take this census tract work into any of the 50 states as opposed to a territory like Puerto Rico. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does make sense. I a lot of the same data that we get as US I think sometimes there's open data that it's not available that would be available to the continental US. But for like the CDC SBI data and US Census data, that was all available in the in Puerto Rico as well, so it wasn't that difficult to make that analysis. And I know now they're also working with the US Virgin Islands to kind of like expand their work into um that region as well because they're also a territory. I think when it comes to challenges, it's definitely getting attention and getting like policies made in Puerto Rico to protect the health and especially as like an island that's like a little bit more further away from the continental US, it could be a challenge. I feel like there's more to say, but I think that kind of encapsulates the experience.
Thank you. Do we have other questions for Ryan and sailing? I know I have a question for Ryan as well. I know you were looking primarily at obesity. I was curious if you're interested in potentially looking into other health markers as well, potentially in the future, whether heart disease or diabetes or anything along those lines.
Yeah, I will say that I kind of started actually looking at diabetes rates, and then I'm kind of limited to, I guess, with the CDC, the health outcomes that they have, but they do have diabetes rates. They do have high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and then like cardiovascular illness as well. And I will say that the dollar store associations do hold predominantly across regions in most cities when it comes to these type of rates itself. So this does hold, and interestingly enough, it does hold across, I guess, other non-cardiometabolic outcomes, but that might speak to more of like the comorbidities or some of those other aspects.
So thank you. Do we have other questions for our presenters from this morning? We don't have other questions. I would like to encourage folks, Danielle put the link in the chat to provide some feedback in our event survey for UCGIS week. As you know, today is only day one of three of our UCGIS week presentations. I hope to see more of you at our other sessions. This afternoon, we're going to have a talk on GIS tool or a session in GIS tools in action, followed by a series of lightning talks focused on environmental geography, and then a workshop on the California tree species range atlas, where if you were in our first session this morning, we got a little bit of a sneak peek of with a presentation from that group, but we'll have a workshop on their tool later this afternoon, followed by some more great presentations tomorrow and Thursday. Also check out our virtual gallery where some folks have submitted their maps that they've presented on so far, as well as feel free to submit your own materials as well and join some of our on-campus mapathon events that are happening. Thank you all again. We hope to see you later this week. And thank you again to our wonderful presenters, Sailing and Ryan.